Yeah, good to go.
Okay, fantastic. So welcome everybody and thank you for joining us today. This is our third patio conversation under the theme Institutions and Post-Colonial. This theme examines questions of agency, equity, and power with particular reference to institutional forms, frameworks, and systems of colonial design and construction and their post-colonial legacies. In this session, we examine built heritage in Jinja, Uganda, and Bulandshahr, India, exploring how unique architectures were produced from specific socio-cultural encounters taking place within extra-colonial networks or beside established colonial systems. So the format today, I'm briefly going to introduce our two presenters and our respondent, and then we'll begin with the papers so that we have plenty of time for discussion afterwards. So our first speaker is Binita Bose. Binita is an assistant professor of the Apeejay School of Architecture in Greater Noida. She completed her master's degree in architectural history and research from CEPT University. This research she'll present today forms part of her directed research project undertaken during her master's program. Her research interests lie in the study of colonial architecture with a particular focus on building practices, media, and the method of building biography as tools to re-examine architectural production. Welcome, Binita. Our second speaker today is Anthony Wako. Welcome, Anthony. He's a lecturer and researcher in architecture at the Faculty of the Built Environment, Uganda Martyrs University. He's the Emerging Architect Fellow for 2025 to 27 at the John H. Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design at the University of Toronto. His teaching and research interests encompass history, theory, built heritage, and sustainable built environments. The majority of his work is interdisciplinary and grounded in built environment pedagogy and architecture ideation processes. He adeptly bridges historical and contemporary issues to thematically showcase future objectives. Anthony is a recipient of the 2024 Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts grant for his project, Tracing the Footprints of Entangled Narratives. And finally, I'd like to introduce our respondent, Peter. Peter Scriver is the founding director of the Center for Asian and Middle Eastern Architecture, CAMEA, at the University of Adelaide, Australia, where he's taught architectural history, theory, and design, and directed postgraduate research since 1996. He's a critical authority on the architecture, construction, and planning histories of colonial and contemporary India. Scriver's work has been pioneering in its theoretical exploration of relationships between cultural and cognitive practices in the design, operation, and reproduction of colonial built environments, and the institutional frameworks and professional networks in which the architectural and engineering disciplines have typically operated in contexts of colonial and post-colonial development. His extensive early research of the built legacy of the British Indian Department of the Public Works and its archives examined the instrumental role of such technocratic agency in the propagation and institutionalization of modern architectural and engineering knowledge in colonial South Asia. Subsequent work on colonial modernities and the scaffolding of empire has been seminal in spearheading the broader and fast-growing body of critical, historical, and theoretical research by Scriver, collaborators, and others on the material and cognitive construction of the global South and its colonial and modern underpinnings. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining us today. And I won't take up any more time. I'm going to call you, Binita, to deliver the first presentation. Thanks very much.
Share screen. Is it visible?
Yeah, that's yes, thanks, Benita. Well, sorry, I should have mentioned that Benita's talk is re-examining the relationship between colonial building practices and native craftsmen, the case of Bulandshahr Town Hall. Thanks, Benita.
Okay. So, hi everybody. Good evening, everyone. I hope you all are having a nice day so far. I would begin by thanking the PATIO platform for giving me this wonderful opportunity to present my work on re-examining the relationship between colonial building practices and native craftsmen, a case of Bulandshahr Town Hall, which was a part of my master's program at CEPT University. So colonial architecture in late 19th century in India is largely understood as a product of public works department, marked by standardized plans, bureaucratical control, and restrained ornamentation, Within this dominant framework, architecture appears systematized and detached from traditional craft practices. It is against this understanding that F.S. Grouse's work becomes significant, as the Bulandshahr Town Hall reveals how his work complicates dominant narratives of colonial building production in late 19th century northern India. So as you can see, in this is an image of Bulandshahr Town Hall from when it was taken when it was constructed during 1883 to 85. Following Ripon's 1882 resolution on local self-government, district towns were encouraged to establish municipal boards. This reform required civic spaces to house public meetings and municipal activities, leading to construction of town hall across colonial India. The Bulandshahr Town Hall was one such building which was supervised by F.S. Growse. So F.S. Growse mostly worked in northwestern province of colonial India. He served as a district magistrate and a collector in Bulandshahr between 1876 to 84. Oh, sorry, overall, no, 1876 to 84, yeah. Unlike most colonial administrator, he was deeply invested in Indian art, craft, and architectural traditions. He also openly criticized the Public Works Department, arguing that its standardized, paper-based system reduced Indian craftsmen to mechanical executors and wasted their inherent uh, artistic tradition. So during his tenure, he supervised several civic structures in Bulandshahr, as you can see, one in Mathura as well, uh, among which one was town hall, and he was attempting to shape the town's architectural identity. The town hall therefore became a key site to examine his architectural position. So to understand Grouse's initiative, we must situate them within the dominant architectural framework of the time. Scholars such as Thomas Metcalfe, Peter Scriver, and Gilles Tillotson describes colonial architectural modernity as rooted in standardization, abstraction, and bureaucratic order. So the Works Department followed what Metcalfe describes as the Western blueprint model, where forms were dictated by the department and reproduced through departmental patterns. As Scriven notes, such buildings were often strikingly chaste and parsimonious compared to the richly carved architecture of earlier empires, whereas traditional Indian building practices, as discussed by Tillotson, were collaborative, adaptive, and materially engaged in methods in the materially engaged. And in this method, design evolved through on-site interaction, and ornamentation was also an integral part of architectural production. Hence, this presentation situates Bulandshahr Town Hall within this tension. So to explore town halls building practice, this research adopts the method of building biography with the help of plans, sections, elevations, with the support of archival photographs like the one shown earlier, monographs on carving, books written by Growse himself, uh, which helped a lot, and some diary entry. So rather than analyzing the town hall only stylistically, it reads the building as an archive of labor, materials, institutional negotiation, and design decisions, where the building itself becomes the primary source of evidence. Following the methodological framing, I now situate the Bulandshahr Town Hall within the larger question of colonial typology. Tallying the plan of town hall with Metcalfe's description of colonial public buildings in one of his papers, where he mentions that the buildings had walls of ample thickness, frequent column, which is clearly followed through in the plan in the town hall as well. Constant use of balconies or verandas, frequent and ample opening. So if you can see, there is this constant similarities with what Metcalfe described, and that has been followed through in the town hall as well, like constant preference of for horizontal cornices, flat roof, very similar to Bulandshahr District Code as well, which was also produced by PWD, but with an ornamented approach of facade as compared to the law courts. This raises some important analytical questions, like if Growse strongly criticized the PWD standardization, why does the town hall still uh, follows a standardized typology? Is this a reflection of bureaucratic expectation and administrative constraint, or does it suggest the limited limits of working within an institutional framework? So rather than reading this as a contradiction, the building suggests negotiation. The planning aligns with civic requirements, while the execution and detailing reveals departure. For the execution of building, Grauss collaborated with various craftsmen uh, who, now this is very interesting, who he came across during his tenure, like as you can see in the western facade of the building, which is also the main entrance of the building. It spots a carved monolithic sandstone uh, uh, wall at the main entrance, which was executed by Mitshu from Mathura, along with other local craftsmen. Its scale suggests on-site carving and an interpretive engagement. Wood carvings on all doors and brass inlay for one door of the town hall of various patterns by Chokelal from Mainpuri, uh, who he came in contact during his tenure in Mainpuri, and other local craftsmen helping. So Chokelal was heading these carvings along with some other local craftsmen. It reflects a prominent role of craftsmen in the ornamentation of the building. Now, one of the most interesting for me, interesting evidence in this is the facade division, which is divided unequally. This irregular division of arches on the northern facade suggests an on-site division, an improvisation beyond rigid blueprint replication. These example reposition native craftsmen not merely as laborers but as co-authors of the building. So the dissection of the plan and facade so far shows involvement of local craftsmen, mostly in the ornamentational approach, design and details and execution of building, justifying the traditional Indian building method approach with colonial reference for the plan. However, there is one problem. Craftsmen dedicating extended periods of to perfecting each detail with patience and precision at that point in time. So, which was they often prioritized uh, working perfection in over time and or monetary constraints. And whereas PWD were typically known for being rational, cost efficient, and standardized style, which also reduced the time of production of the building. So Grauss used hierarchy with ornamentation. Like if you see, only the ground floor is richly ornamented, while the first floor is very less ornamented in both interior and exterior, which justifies the eye level in human scale. In addition, he also defined hierarchy through materiality, like using stone, which is expensive in the main entrance, facade arches and cornices, and brick, which is affordable in the first floor cornice. This rationalized the cost of the building. He also used the degree of detail for wood carving, wood carved door to rationalize time, like using detailed carving for the main entrance doors and leaving the other doors vaguely detailed. He is also defining spatial hierarchy. through ornamentation. Like if you see, the western entrance of the facade is richly detailed in combination with different materials, which symbolizes ceremonial importance of the threshold in a hall for ceremonies. Hence, when positioned within the larger architectural landscape of late 19th century colonial India, F.S. Growse appears as a distinctive but not entirely oppositional figure. The period was largely shaped by institutional authority of the Public Works Department, marked by standardized plans, bureaucratic control, and the separation of design from craft. Architecture increasingly became abstract, paper-based, and systematic. Grauss worked within this administrative framework, yet his initiative in Bulandshahr reveals a different approach to building production. While he accepted the civic typology required under Rippon's reform, he altered the manner of execution, actively engaging local craftsmen, encouraging ornamentation, and allowing interpretive flexibility on site. He did not dismantle the colonial system, nor did he produce a fully alternative architectural model. Instead, his work represents a negotiated deviation within it. In this sense, Grauss occupies a lesser examined middle ground in colonial architectural history between rigid bureaucratic production and later revivalist movements. The Bulandshahr Town Hall, therefore, demonstrate that colonial architecture was not entirely monolithic. It contained internal variations shaped by individual administrators and local craftsmen. Through this case, the relationship between colonial building practice and native craftsmen emerges not as simply domination or resistance, but as a complex and negotiated entanglement. Thank you.
Catherine, are you there?
Sorry, I lost my internet connection for a moment. Thank you so much, Binita. We're going to move now to Anthony's presentation. Anthony's going to be presenting a paper tracing the footprints of entangled narratives of South Asian migrants to Uganda between 1900 and 1972. Thanks so much, Anthony.
Just let me know. Can you see my screen? Full screen?
Yes.
Yeah, that's
okay. Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be back at the PATIO Conversation platform to share my key research findings and my updates. For the sake of those who missed my presentation in 2024, August, under PATIO Conversations 3, I will give a background to this research. This study focuses on Jinja, a city in eastern Uganda with an intact collection of buildings from the 20th century. It delves into the histories of migrants from South Asia who contributed to the architecture and urbanism of Jinja. The contribution of Asians to Uganda's urban and architectural heritage is often talked about, but remains hidden in the documented history. This research sought to examine the contribution of South Asian migrants to East Africa, highlighting their influence on the architecture of the region with emphasis on Uganda and drawing attention to the stories surrounding the buildings left behind after the 1972 critical event. Just a brief history. After the seat of the Omani Sultanate was transferred to Zanzibar in 1840, travelers in search of opportunities with the assistance of Indian Ocean monsoon current were obliged to pass through Zanzibar. Now, Zanzibar naturally attracted visitors from across the Indian Ocean, with merchants from the Indian subcontinent playing key roles in economic endeavors, many becoming intermediaries in the lucrative trade with the interior of East Africa. As a consequence, migration from the Indian subcontinent to East Africa increased significantly after 1840s, with three principal groups of migrants. And these were merchants and traders, civil servants, and indentured laborers. A key figure of these traders and merchants was Alidina Visram, who migrated penniless to Zanzibar at the age of 12 and found work with a prominent local trader, and later branched out and began organizing his own caravans into the interior. By the time the railway in East Africa was completed, Visram and his agents were at most of the stations operating his businesses. Now, the third category were the laborers from the Indian subcontinent, largely from the Gujarat and the Punjab regions of India. They came to construct the Uganda Railway between 1896 and 1901. This marked the beginning of a significant movement of labor across the Indian Ocean and also linked the inland port of Jinja to the East African coast. After the completion of the railway, a good approximate of about 20% of the laborers remained unsettled in the interior of East Africa. In Jinja, the Asian population grew with an estimated 12,500 Asians living in the urban area by 1967. By the time of their expulsion from Uganda in 1972, close to 80,000 left the country. Jinja represented 16% of that Asian population, second to Kampala, the capital of Uganda. Today, Jinja is one of the few cities in Uganda with an intact collection of buildings that showcase the efforts of these migrants. Ironically, their continued existence is a consequence of the economic vacuum caused by the exodus following their expulsion. The Departed Asians Property Custodian Board, which was established as trustee over expropriated properties in 1973, estimated up to 1,000 properties in Jinja alone. 21 years before the critical event, and just before the completion of the Owen Falls Dam at Jinja in 1953, the Asian population had already played an important role in starting and supporting industrial growth in the country, owning the most gineries and maize mills. After the completion of the dam, Jinja became Uganda's preeminent industrial hub, taking advantage of the cost of hydroelectric power over shorter distances. In 1901, evidence suggests that Haji Tamachi was the first prominent Asian trader in Jinja. He initially worked under the mentorship of the previously mentioned Alidina Visram before establishing his first duka in a mud hut on the western bank of the River Nile. He moved across to Jinja later in the same year, setting up a Americani tent, cloth-like structure that was placed along Main Street. Haji Tamachi also built and financed the first post office in Uganda, based in Jinja, indicated by the green circle on the 1906 Jinja plan. After the colonial administration claimed it was not viable to build one at that time, the first post office building does not exist, but is often presented in media as the 1950s building, which is indicated in the yellow circles, located north of the original location of the post office. And this is at the intersection of Main Street and Bell Avenue. This is one of the key narratives that this research project sought to rectify. Haji Tamachi is credited with encouraging other Indians to settle and trade in Jinja. He had good working relations with Vitaldas Haridas and Visram Haridas. Both were uncles to Muljibai Madivani. Madivani worked for his uncles. He also worked for Alidina Visram and also worked for Haji Tamachi at different times upon arrival into the Ugandan Protectorate. The first shop or duka, which was owned by his uncles, was demolished. However, after he had gained financial prosperity, he and his uncles completed the Madivani building in Jinja in 1919. It was home to the uncles and also the office for the Madivani family. The building was a commercial headquarters with a retail store on the ground floor, and it was a symbol of business growth for the Madivani family, who took full ownership after an asset allocation lottery with the uncles and other partners. His name and uncles' names are branded on the face of the building. He also wielded considerable influence on public infrastructure, evident in the 10,000 British pound gift towards the construction of the town hall in 1956. This was 2 years before his death. Notice this is a very different typology from what Binita presented of the town hall. One of the less trending Asians in Uganda's history is Kadaboy family. They migrated to Jinja in the early 20th century and years later built this Duka building on Main Street. I hope the floor plan is clear enough. While this building has the typical Duka components of a large veranda, the baraza, a retail space, and a sleeping quarter or storage space, as shown in these original drawings, less is known about the Kadaboy family and its relation to the building. The family is remembered for the Nick building along Main Street, built sometime in the mid-20th century. However, it was an interesting narrative. So ownership of the Kadaboy Duka building is corroborated by another South Asian migrant, Nilesh Nathwani, in Valley Jamal's 2017 publication. Nathwani states that his family moved from Nairobi and started a regular Duka because the uncle did not want to sin by crushing insects, while gaining cotton. His family built a house opposite Kadaboy building, which later became a Duka, which was also located 3 houses south of the Madivani building. Here we see an example of socio-cultural aspects contributing to the decisions of building choices. Also, the caption of the images on the bottom right show a close relationship between Nathwani, Pond family that married into the Madivani family and also lived on the upper floor of the Madivani building. Photo is also shown instead. The Asian stories surrounding Jinja's historic buildings. These stories cut across 2 to 3 generations with anecdotes of lesser known personalities linked to more famous ones. And more importantly, these stories are threaded across a built environment via streetscapes and neighborhoods. This can be attributed to their adopted lifestyles, in many cases socializing amongst friends and families. Evidence of their philanthropic endeavors exists, but what is more enticing are the autobiography of some famous names and how they all came to East Africa at tender ages and made it through difficult working conditions. In these cases, information was unpacked and followed a trajectory, linked the wealthy and the non-wealthy at the time. The narratives of the women have also received less credit for their contribution. However, some diasporic descendant women have told these stories through cooking, support of family businesses, and their histories across generations. The Asian legacy is thus embedded in the pain of their exodus, celebrating their business astuteness, philanthropic disposition, and their falls and triumphs. While this research had addressed multiple dimensions, the social one presented an important strand that resonated with the suppressed heritage voices of Jinja's neighborhoods. This was the output from an urban design studio that I conducted in collaboration with between the Uganda Martyrs University students and students at the University of Toronto. So for the students at U of T, one project focused on women's hidden narratives, going beyond the counter and the facade and using the baraza as a living archive for women's contributions. And the other on landscape and memory of the voiceless, delving into the liminal and in-between spaces. The background of this studio came from this research project as an urban design studio focusing on historical aspects while acknowledging that no individual building can narrate the South Asian stories, but rather a composition of the built and unbuilt environments. At the start of this research project, attention was drawn to the Duka building, which represents a transition to modernity. The ever-present Duka is so mundane that it is hardly a building of choice befitting a contemporary or modern description. The paper titled Architecture and the Social Realm of the Duka, which is currently under review and stemmed from this research. And this paper highlighted how the Duka is tied to the history of Jinja, the lower middle class society, and marginalized Asian social groups within the East African landscape. While many old Dukas have been demolished due to pressure from the need to have newer buildings within the urban centers, the idea of trading within the dukkha-like interior spaces have persisted in many places. The memory of how the buildings became rooted in Uganda as a source of income for many and has generally contributed to the informal economy. This is something that is worth preserving. And the narratives surrounding some of these buildings is worth retelling. To many, the dukkha continues to perform as a commercial and dwelling unit, which has saved many families from extreme poverty while borrowing cues from the adventurous spirits of the early Asian entrepreneurs. And I'll just conclude with the summative schedule for this project, which sought to document the socio-cultural encounters of Jinja's built heritage, a visible but hidden legacy. This research was undertaken through archival research and some ongoing interviews with some Asian descendants in the diaspora. So engaging with archives in Kenya, the UK, Uganda, India, and most recently, Canada, provided insights into the impact and migration to and from these places in order to sort of understand the stories around Jinja's buildings. So there are key pending milestones, including a submission to the journal and a comprehensive document that is supposed to be submitted to the Jinja City Planning Division by mid-2026. And hopefully that will tie up everything together. And I will probably clap my hands and be happy at that. Thank you very much for listening. And over to you, Catherine.
Thanks so much, Anthony, and thanks, Binita, for these two exceptionally interesting presentations. I'm really looking forward to the discussion on these. Before we move to response from Peter, I'd just like to say that we're taking questions in the chat. If you'd like to type questions for either of the presenters, we'll also be opening for and discussion after the response. But yeah, if you'd like to type your questions, please type them. And also just to let you know that this theme, institutions, colonial and post-colonial, Peter Scriver is of course the director of this theme. I'm the coordinator, Catherine Desai, and Peter's also acting as our respondent today. So I'd like to pass over to you, Peter, and to thank you both, Anthony and Binita.
Thank you, Binita and Anthony, very much for these both very rich and fascinating presentations, and thank you for agreeing to present. We were hoping to have Binita be one of our very first presenters last year. She was keen to share this work, but I think we benefited probably from further detailed work in the year since. So thank you for being patient, and I was just to explain the kind of chemistry of what we're doing here. I think that the relationship to the institutional framework was very clear in the way Binita framed her presentation, and I'll come back to those details, particularly around engagement with the Public Works Department in a moment. I brought Anthony in again, who was another who wasn't, as we know, an earlier presenter in an early CAMEA PATIO Conversation, not as what we had ideally hoped to put Binita's work up together with, but because he's been contributing to this research both within this larger framework of the transposition in some direct or indirect ways of this broader colonial system, the export of these assumptions perhaps about how public architecture and the everyday framework of a colonial space might be established in a new land, so to speak. But equally, because the project, as we've just learned, is now well advanced and has been progressing for some time, I was particularly interested to understand how Anthony has attempted to use the colonial archive, as we heard in the summing up points. Thank you for outlining those, Anthony. your move out of Uganda into India, UK, and then even Canada. But I'm particularly interested in your efforts try to penetrate or unpack some of these details in the fortress of the Colonial Archive in India, in a sense of the institution of knowledge and how it is framed and assumed to be a repository of certain things we expect to find there. When you have unexpected questions, how easy is it to unpack it from that systematic way of storing that information? So perhaps we'll come back to that when you speak again in a moment. So to Binita's fascinating work, which I have been intrigued to learn more about for some time, not least because, as you clearly laid out, the figure of Growse, this colonial administrator who those of us who worked on the colonial architecture of India have seemingly learned a great deal about, because he's such a fascinating curmudgeon within the system who produced a discourse or a counter discourse, as some of my colleagues have written about it, that really produced space, raised questions, raised doubt as to whether the system that the colonial modern system of building production was really serving India in the best way. We have many political and other critiques, I think, that have, of course, been widely developed in other disciplines of critiquing the colonial system, but our efforts in this space to look at it as you so clearly laid out through the biography of a building, this bottom up or this materially grounded position that I think we're all embracing in this space of architectural and construction history, really allows us to look at how there's a much more nuanced way we can understand what's going on. So I really enjoyed and appreciated that clear methodological framing up front that you provided, and then of course the emergence of the detail and the nuanced further interpretation of what was actually going on in the building of this minor regional town and its modern buildings. These town hall that is, I mean, it's a modern public building wasn't something that was precedented in the fabric of a typical settlement in the past, but mandated sense by the colonial system, saying you need to have a public place where the government interfaces with the people at the local level. But the way in which you've opened up the reading of the fabric to understand how this, as you've emphasized, the negotiation between the possibilities of the new and the continuity of the existing or the living traditions that have been written much about. You've looked at how they actually interacted, and I kind of celebrated in my little notes I was making on the side the fact that you did see that there was not so much this sort of total opposition, saying I'm not going to do it by the mandated way that's coming down from the district engineers and such. I'm going to give it all to the local craftsmen. No, you sort of showed how this building type clearly was a novelty, but that in the mode of production of the native craftsmen, the focus on detail, I was particularly the observations about the cadences of the work, the time scales in which work could be produced, and where the emphasis of how that could play out against the inevitable time pressures on budgeting and delivery were were negotiated rather than ruptured. So I think that's an important contribution to the discussion, and returning, in fact, to this, quite famous but superficially received case study. I think for the most people who've looked at it before, they sort of said, right, there was this exception, this strange exception, perhaps, that you've now come back to and looked at in more detail. I will put a question to you to consider, maybe now before we go to Anthony, whether you did struggle or spend time in the official archive and find perhaps anything different to what we thought we knew from previous writing about this case, versus what you sort of found on the ground in your empirical observations. Were there any new documents in the formal archive of, say, the public works proceedings that haven't been discussed before that are relevant to this case in particular? Or is the work entirely grounded in the field work, the casework in the town itself?
Thank you for asking that question, Peter. So the work is mostly grounded based on the building itself. Since it was when I started with this work, there was very little information about Growse itself, and all I could collect is more bits and pieces. I could not get my hands on Grouse's book as well. There are two books that he had published on Bulandshahr. So in the second part, he's largely talking about town hall. But one of the interesting thing is, I think he's mentioning a lot of things about this town hall. One such example is a pair of brass wire inlay doors, which I could not find while I was on site. And the flooring also differed a lot. So I think that they modified it with time, but when I interviewed the people there, it is now used as an election commission office. So they were also unaware, even the oldest people who were working there for a long time, they were also unaware of the brass door, whereas that is mentioned in articles of newspapers because it went for Calcutta exhibition in 1884. So I think that one pair of door was very interesting, and Growse is emphasizing in his writing, which was very hard to find on site, and it was not there. But there are images, there are pictures of it in his book itself. So yeah, that is one of those things. And then he also mentions that he had to leave the construction midway. He was transferred to Fatehpur while it was around its completion. So some of the things he predicted kind of that he was sure that were not executed till the end, which he meant to, which he planned for.
Okay, now that's interesting. Would that being the case that he was transferred, and I've always had the impression that because he pushed against the grain, he effectively got himself sidestepped or even demoted from where he might have imagined or expected to be progressing in his career. His ideology, his personality said, to heck with that. I'll do what I'm going to do, and suffered for it, but heroically perhaps. Did that mean because he was transferred that might also be an explanation for why things were so in a sense partial? I think it was really interesting how you focus on where the uniqueness of the building resides and where it sort of is compromised or at least negotiated and less emphatic. So it seems to, I guess, he also left. He was not there, so maybe the successors were less enthusiastic in enabling work to continue.
Also, one of the interesting thing, I think he is also emphasizing mostly on the ornamentations and the traditional aspects of it in his writing, rather than talking about the planning of the building. He is very hardly mentioning and talking about how the building was planned and how the building. He only mentions about the hall, I guess, but he is largely talking about the different components, I think, which here his interest lied in different objects and how he is in incorporating them in a building, since these brass inlays and wooden carving were not used on a larger scale before, like that much. Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks. And this work is continuing, I guess. Well, I look forward to seeing it further developed and published, and really exciting and subtle observations, which I think on that point, I think that the idea that you've emphasized in your short presentation was this fact of negotiation. Yes, there was a system, there were expectations, there were regulations and such that implied that the outcome might be absolutely standardized, but this kind of radically different solution was an outcome of working within those constraints. And I think this is an idea that I've sort of had as an hypothesis for a long time in my work, which work like yours is helping us see might indeed be more the case. I want to shift now to Anthony's continuing work on this diffusion of some of these colonial patterns to East Africa. And you reminded us that the main focus of your earlier presentation was the dukkha, the very mundane, the ubiquitous form of commercial traders, the typology of the veranda, and then the warehouse and shop behind, that was became sort of, as I understand it, synonymous at that time, at least, with the South Asian traders, who were more often than not the ones who were running these shops. How that architectural pattern becomes a method or a means through which very significant cultural and social engagement is happening across a number of decades, for half a century at least, or 3/4 of a century, in the history of modern East Africa. The next stage of your work, which we've learned about today, was very rich, where you're getting more into the additional ethnographic methods for trying to populate this framework. It's also very intriguing to see, and to recognize that we can only go so far, perhaps, with the building fabric itself, to learn some of the things that you're finding out in this more interdisciplinary method. I was intrigued, for instance, with the cookbooks that you showed later on, but particularly the title of one of them that said, what did you say, the Settler's Cookbook. This consciousness that this group was migrating from India over a number of decades, and consciously seeing themselves as settler colonists themselves in that part of the world, which I guess the event in 1972 with the expulsion from Uganda of that entire population was a political moment of pushback, of waking up to a process in which, and I think that's the interesting thing for myself to wake up to, the idea that apart from the obvious northern white settlers who were ostensibly those in control, that there were this other very significant and diverse group that was coming across through these various industrial and labor and trade means to become part of that population as well. Let's come back to the question that is particularly on my mind here about how we're learning through the buildings and through the histories of those who built them and developed them. You got further from your last presentation to the personal histories of at least two families whose names and material you shared with us. And I understand that some months ago when we were in correspondence about how do you make a short trip to the National Archives in Delhi and find something out when you have a bit of grant money and you can get there and you have the thirst, the zeal of a scholar to ask a question that no one's ever asked before. And I understand you went to the National Archives in Delhi with searching perhaps for the trace of some members of those families or some of the functionaries. I'm wondering what led you to think you might find something in Delhi about them or the industries they were involved in. What was the specific question you were taking there, and what was the experience in penetrating that institutional fortress of the official archive?
Thank you, Peter. I like how you called it a fortress. I would say that part of this engagement and this movement across to India, to Kenya, to the UK in search of information, I guess starts with the frustrations in the local archives in Uganda, whereby access is very difficult. You need to pay some money, and it's usually not easy to get. But also, for example, a foreign national would have to pay, I think, either $100 or $300 to just access the archives. And on top of that, the archives themselves are managed by another organization within the government, which is under science and technology, which only seeks to, I guess, look out for things that are going against the current government. And then when you submit your application to that organization, it also has to transfer that information to the State House. So for an individual to do research, you literally have to go through all those hoops. Now going to these other places, you've mentioned New Delhi. It sort of gave me the freedom to search for the information that I would have otherwise gotten at home. At home, I got some information here and there, but a lot more is spread across the UK and all these other places. With the ones in India, it was quite more straightforward than it was in Uganda. And when I got there, it was there is little. There were a few documents that I could physically look at, because they were in the process of digitizing the entire archives. And when I signed up to be part of the mailing group and also be able to access these archives online, I couldn't actually get access for the first I think 3 months, because I went in April, and 3 months later is only when I managed to get the digitized versions. So I wonder whether it was even necessary to travel, but at least the getting a feel of the old document and seeing it there is something about it, and also smelling whatever dust has accumulated. There is something rich about that document, and then it's also as piggybacking on the research itself and trying to situate how to find that information was, of course, it's not usually, it wasn't easy, like a needle in a haystack, but I sort of focused on key highlights or historical highlights in some moments that linked Uganda and India at that time. And one of them in the early 20th century was the transfer of businesses, goods and services to India from Uganda, because at the time of after World War I, there was a lot of Britain was not able to continue with sustaining its extractive process of the raw materials to London. So a lot of Asian business figures came up and were able to transfer some of these resources to some of the, I guess, the industries in India at that time. So that was a very interesting point to start and just pick up and see whichever names show up, you know, and when those names show up, you find it probably in another archive and things like that. So it was quite interesting, sometimes confirming and disconfirming some of the positions that I already had, and also, I guess, going beyond the physical buildings and trying to understand, but what led this individual to come settle in Uganda, and then later go back, leave the children behind, to sort of like carry on the processes of whatever he had started as a business, and also in some cases what led them to, you know, continue staying in the country, and then move that forward. But overall, it was worthwhile. It was worthwhile, and it's surprising how many documents of one country you can actually find in another, and how much information they actually possess, because sometimes it shocks you, but you have to know whether to actually take it in, or, you know, or how to filter it and make it relevant to whatever discussion you are researching about. Yep. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. I guess just further to that question, I'm just wondering what you mentioned this fascinating percolation back to India in the disruption, I guess, of World War I. Can you just explain that a little bit more? Because I suspect one of our I think I saw Pedro. Pedro is here. One of our respondents will.
Yes.
Will be...
Hi, Pedro. Thank you very much. Pedro was very helpful in sharing some information after my first PATIO discussion. Yes.
Yeah. This industrial to and fro. So one of the some of the family you kind of justified your trip to India because you thought there was that among other things you might find that might reveal sort of some cracks in the fortress and open up more knowledge. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on that moment, or that part in the middle of your historical timeline that was this sort of disruptive moment, or the shift moment?
Yeah. So at the back of or what is known was that there are some key factories like the sugar factory in Uganda was started sometime before the Owen Falls Dam was constructed, and this and other greeneries and maize mills were actually started much earlier. So these initially had their they initially had their collections of raw materials extracted to the UK or to London, to the Liverpool industries. But then after the disruptions of the war, and actually during the war itself, not even after, but during the war, there is a shift and things change direction. This sort of consolidated it consolidated the fact that there is a link, or there is a connection between there is a further connection between the two places. The initial one being the migration of people from India to Uganda, and now we see resources doing a reverse direction, and people themselves doing back and forth. So it put the information collected at a point whereby it was a form of justification, but also a form of I guess playing around with the colonial movement of things, of labor, of ideas, and this really informed the place of India in East Africa. It's not just about people coming to East Africa, but it's also doing the reverse. So there is a reciprocal discussion.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think this is very intriguing, and I think central to what PATIO in principle is about is the networked idea of knowledge and movement and exchanges that sometimes or more often not are set up for one very intentional, determined, specific aim. But once these systems or connections are established, once a framework is established, a system is established. If we kind of bring Binita's work back in here, such as the systemic way in which pattern-based buildings were being produced in India, or extractive colonial plantation industries and such were being established in Africa in the later 19th century by what was now a sort of a global and imperial system. It had a clear purpose that we can understand in terms of conventional colonial practices, but the holistic reality is that many other players, and now in particular in your work, Anthony, you're sort of highlighting the South Asian dimension of this system becomes understandably, by definition, sort of opportunistic, or it is there to begin to act differently. So I think there's this is perhaps the connection I'm making between these two presentations and two fascinating bits of grounded research in action that we're seeing in different parts of our spectrum here, where the sort of robust capacity to negotiate or flow or flux in different ways and intended of the sort of the system are being demonstrated in unique or interesting variations of what is assumed is emerging. I think I could waffle on and we could talk about more details much more, but I wonder whether Catherine can remind me whether we have any questions in the pipeline that could bring some of the rest of the audience in before we use up our time.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, I was just going to call in Ashita with a question for Anthony, and then Pedro with a question for Binita. We've got some great questions in the chat here.
Great.
Ashita, can I ask you to go first? Hi, Ashita and Pedro. It's good to see you both.
Hi, Ashita.
Hi, Peter. Hi, Catherine. Hi, Anthony. I'm actually surprised that I seem to have missed your last presentation, but I think there's always right timing. I say this because we have been working on a research project with one of the families who have had tea estates and sugar factories in East Africa, who are now settled in India, and I'll get in touch with you to tell you more about it. But for now, I think I wanted to sort of highlight the possibility that Duka is actually an extension or an incomplete word from Dukan, which actually means shops in Gujarati. And I was wondering if you had dwelled into any cultural references or regional references. I mean, cultural, yes, but more micro or regional references. Because Dukan would obviously come from very colloquial Gujarati, and perhaps that is where I'm coming from, seeing that as a possibility. Also, the bungalows or the houses that you showed, the aesthetic sense or even the typology is very similar to single or bungalow-like units that were being built, especially in tier towns, I mean, tier 2, tier 3 cities in Gujarat at that time. But these were still sort of demarcation of an estate or a legacy family. So these buildings, not that other houses were not single units, but this aesthetic sort of amplifies the socioeconomic position of the residents. And these kind of houses still exist in Gujarat. So I was wondering if these kind of cultural references or regional references have been part of the research and if they're of interest.
Thank you, Ishita. Great question. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, so yes, very true about the definition and its origin. So that is very true, and it is something that I highlighted in, I guess, the first patio discussion that I had, or that we had here, patio 3. There was a lot of transplanting of architecture from South Asia to East Africa. The duka, the bungalow, the quite a number of them were transplanted into East Africa, and so the socio-cultural, I guess, positions and situations for the communities themselves in Jinja, for example, I would say they sort of like carried on in there, and yes, it happened, and many of them kept to themselves, but also partly because at the time Jinja was actually quite segregated. So it's one thing reading it in a book where someone states that there was a racial divide, and then hearing it from a written account of an individual that we couldn't do this. My father was actually chased out of one of the European schools, and that was one of the individuals that I highlighted. So it also contributed to I would say a new or a different or a modified version of life away from home. And so in Uganda, well, buildings have been transplanted from South Asia. There has to be there is this adaptation that was happening, and some of the buildings have persisted. Others have been copied across the entire urban footprint of Uganda. It has gone into modification. So it has, there's an initial idea that gets built on by another and another and another. And so tracing those little steps is part of this discussion, but also bringing to light and making it known to a number of individuals, especially in the planning department and the city authorities, just so you can make a case for the buildings, is also another, I guess, dimension that I focused on in a way. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And some of these things.
I think
yes.
if I can just add to that question,
Yes.
thanks for clarifying that. I think where I'm coming from, and this is very limited understanding because we have worked with right now 2 families and their ethnographies and oral histories. But what we are sort of picking from their conversations is not only just the need to transplant an architectural style across shores, but also a socio-political behavior in terms of wanting to continue a similar life or the rootedness to be able to say that, oh, we lived away from Gujarat, or we lived away from our land, but we were very rooted in our cultures and traditions, and we had similar kinds of lifestyle, we had similar groups between these families. While there were cordial relationships, there was also very strong economical and political ties and misconducts, etc. So I was wondering if that is equally important to the narrative, and investigating it. I don't know whether it was really happening, but is that something that architecture plays a role in making one believe that it was happening?
That's an interesting question. That's an interesting question. But in a way, it does. But also I guess there was something to also consider in this research that while these buildings came up, there were various other societies, or I don't know how to call them. There were the Ismaili, there were the Goans, and people from different areas that created those social niches and had different ways of I guess interpreting their shop cam houses, that were being used, and also other forms of architecture and other ways and other contributions to this architecture in Jinja. But yes, points and cues are picked from what you've just asked. So yes.
Thanks, Ashita. Thanks, Anthony. I wanted to add a question about the plan typology. Anthony, I was really interested in the typology of the shop house that you showed, but I'm going to leave that till afterwards because I'd like to call Pedro in to ask his question to Binita. Thanks, Pedro.
Hi, Binita. Look, I was impressed by your talk. I really enjoyed it, and the idea that there was this overall plan for the town hall that was an immutable transfer of something official, which was then handed over to the craftsmen to embellish in their own way. I mean, to me, that was a kind of, to some extent, represented a fairly natural way of building. I can imagine a previous European system where there would be an architect having a kind of overall plan, but then a lot of the work might be done by craftsmen, particularly in a medieval context. But then I think the work that came a little later with Swinton Jacob with the portfolio was another way was an attempt at imposing a system on ornament. And I mean, I've looked through the portfolios quite carefully several times. I mean, not an expert in this whole area, but to me, I find it really intriguing that the portfolios are actually to do with dismembering Indian architecture. It's a complete mixture of various different things in the hope that somebody would put it together. So you'd be kind of making a bird out of a piece of a frog and a piece of a horse. It's so to me the approach that Growse had kind of seemed a really naively intelligent way of doing it, which was to sort of respect the craftsmen for their knowledge and not interfere with the heritage of their culture in producing relevant ornament onto something that was imposed on them. I mean, and I think that would be an interesting discussion to have. I mean, what do you think?
Thank you, Pedro, for your question. I think this question that you asked was one of the initial question I asked myself while getting started with the research, because I was familiar with Swinton Jacob and his work initially. I came across about his work a lot, but I was very quite unfamiliar with the work of Growse. So this is one of the questions, that how is he different from Jacob himself and what Jacob was doing. So to build up a little bit of context in terms of Jacob and Growse. So Swinton Jacob himself was in PWD, and he was later also transferred into a branch of PWD in Jaipur, I think. And he was an architect and engineer, whereas Growse was a civil servant. He was not in architecture, or whatever he understood about building or crafts was completely driven through his interest in art and crafts and interaction with craftsmen and everything. So I'm drawing a little bit of reference here from colonial modernities, but what Jacob was doing was he was practicing technical drawings. He was documenting those motifs and those detailings, and he was kind of passing it down to the craftsmen to learn further and copying them, and which kind of gives the craftsmen a sort of systematic guidance rather than letting them create. Whereas in town hall, if we look at, so I'll take an example of jalis. There has been different patterns of jalis that has been used above doors in town hall. All of the jalis that I noticed were of different patterns. Even even the wood carvings that were done for the doors, they might have been with the same family, like there were geometric patterns and floral patterns, two kind of patterns. The doors were of same family, but all of the patterns were pretty much very different. None of them were similar. So there was no following up with the design or the carvings that they were doing. It's usually in Indian context. Also, when the carvings happen, the craftsmen usually go forward with whatever they feel like looks best. And that is the approach that Growse was taking, whereas Jacob was still kind of following through the idea of system in his through his approach towards these detailings. I hope
Binita,
I'm able to.
yeah, look, I'm a little bit troubled by Jacob, because I think that his process of recording was an interesting one, and he had a good relationship with the people who actually taught him what he was drawing, and he was trying to teach them through those drawings. But I think the purpose of his portfolios was to create a system that could be distributed a little bit like the plans for buildings and all that. So it was a dismembered system of ornament that could be used. I mean, look, he also wrote a few things. I seem to remember he did something on jalis and the process of making jalis in plaster and all that, which actually does respect the craftsperson, so it's a very complex area, and I think you're going to have a lot of fun kind of moving through that thicket.
Yeah, I understand. But yeah, this does need a little bit of more exploration. I agree with you, but I think because I'll have to get into detail work of Jacobs also to compare through, since I'm getting a lot in detail. I'll have to get into the details of carvings and patterns, which Jacob was also documenting. So I think, yeah, that's a very good direction that I would like to explore further. Thank you so much.
I think in Pedro's question, and perhaps also in both of the presentations, there's a value in looking at the function of the object in these kind of histories that you guys are both writing. And I'm wondering, Binita, if in looking at a wider source of buildings, we might find that this attitude is more prevalent than we expect. So, for example, even in the modern period, you get something like Bulandshahr, built in the 1950s. There are still craftspeople in that building who are employed to develop their own designs under the kind of overall coordination of the engineer. And I think that there are other sort of colonial examples as well, where we see the hint of things, if we look carefully at the building, that may not have come from the solely from the kind of draftsman or from the kind of engineer who's overseeing these kind of projects. I think, in looking widely at buildings, we perhaps have the answers to some of these questions. And likewise, Anthony, I was absolutely fascinated by these plans of the Dukas. They have a three-sided veranda, right, around the shop at the front. Did I read the plan correctly? It was on the screen for only a limited amount of time.
I can put up the screen again, but the veranda is at the front. Let me see.
Only along one side, or it wraps around the edges of the shop?
No. This particular one has it's facing the street, so it only has at the
on the front. Okay.
On the front.
I maybe misread one of the plans. I'd kind of read it that there was a three-sided veranda, because I was interested in the idea that perhaps the typology itself, like the word and the idea of combining shop and home, is perhaps coming from the disparate sort of populations who are coming from India and building these buildings. But I'm wondering whether the typology is shifting subtly, and whether the kind of parts in the function are adapting to the new context, or, to the sort of business that's being done, even to the urban context that's there. I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but in the shops that I've experienced, say in the old parts of Ahmedabad or some of the old towns of Gujarat, they're very densely packed. And I'm wondering if in kind of a newer built environment, then, the condition is different, so the typology adapts. So yeah, I was just thinking that perhaps in the typology of those plans themselves, there's some kind of observation.
Yeah, so you're not far off. Yes, it's adopting to I guess the new context, economic situation, and I guess space and so many other things, and having all sorts of other things coming in. I mean, we can go into heavy discussions about this. In some places they are densely, close together. Others it's a vertical movement. Others it's incorporated within a bigger enclave of or community of buildings. So yes, it is. Yes, it is. But the original ones are quite interesting. Yes, Pedro.
Catherine, do you mind if I jump in here? Look, as an East African myself, I'm a pale African, but to me the interesting thing is how the shops were used in the initial stages. I know that things would have changed, but in the part of East Africa that I come from, similar buildings to the Dukas had a similar use arrangement to shops in Ahmedabad, where the person, or in Syria, where the person who ran the shop would not actually allow the public into the shop. All the selling would take place in the semi-public space, the veranda space. So, and to me, the interesting thing would be, when did the public start penetrating the internal thing? Because where I come from, in Mozambique, those shops were to some extent storage, but also factories where they made clothes and things like that. And the retail was actually far more public. They didn't have windows and things like that. When at the end of the day, everything would go into the place and it would become a warehouse. So the use pattern is really an interesting thing. The other thing that I think would interest me in relation to your study and the sociological side of it is a lot of these people who came to build the railway were actually indentured labor that were brought from India, right? So the process through which they were indentured is really interesting because that would have actually established an arbitrary point of origin because there would be contractors collecting those people to go to build the railway. So there's a whole infrastructure of supplying labor to this colonial thing, which is actually very, very similar to what happened in South Africa with the Indian labor that came to build railways and also to run the sugar plantations in Natal. And I mean, in a sense, it might be worth your while to go to South Africa to look at the Indian context there, because those people, in spite of apartheid and all that kind of stuff, they remained there, whereas the Ugandan Asians actually were expelled. So there are aspects of continuity and cultural depth which have continuity in South Africa, also under regimes of discrimination and stuff like that. So, it's Anthony, you've got a lot of work to do.
Can I just add one more small point, if it's
Hold my
okay?
hand.
Yes, and then
I'm
we'll
sure-
wind up after that. Thanks, Ashita.
Yeah, I was
Yeah,
just adding to what Pedro was mentioning, again, back to socio-cultural patterns, because what we found out that the idea of labor was also very family oriented. The fact that a lot of members of the family or friends or relatives were called from Gujarat to take over a lot of the work that happened with the industries and with the shops. Yeah, I think I don't have a point to make, but I think the question of how this network was formed in terms of labor and relationships, moving from socio-cultural to socio-economic discrepancies, is something that we are finding it very fascinating in the work that we are doing.
Oh, look, sorry, I'm sorry to hog this, but there's just one other point, which is that one of the things that the colonial Portuguese administration found really infuriating in southern Mozambique was that the merchants from Gujarat had enormously effective systems of credit and also understanding of local markets. So they undercut any other kinds of colonial merchants altogether because they had amazing systems of supply chains, credit, knowledge about what things could be bought, what things could be sold, all that kind of stuff. And I think that ecology of business is actually also another really important thing, because I'm sure the British in Uganda who tried to set up shops were completely defeated by these people who actually understood the market, had credit systems, they had networks that allowed the trade to prosper, and that's probably what really upset guys like Idi Amin, that there were these kind of really strong established systems that kind of couldn't be defeated unless you expelled that population. Sorry.
No, thanks, Pedro. So as usual, we've got a discussion that it would be wonderful to continue. I think there are so many interesting questions that have emerged out of the questions that have been discussed. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. We've been going for 1.5 hours. So I've got one brief announcement, and then Peter, I'll ask you just to close the session. Any last comments if you have. But before we do that, I wanted to let you all know that next month, PATIO is holding a special hybrid symposium on solidarities in the Indian Ocean Rim. It's on Saturday, the 7th of March. The weekend before our usual session. Please make sure you're signed up to the mailing list. If you're signed up, you'll receive the information about our live session. And for anybody who's not able to attend, we'll be putting up the recordings through the PATIO channel as usual. So next month we'll be having a live symposium. And thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Binita, and thank you, Ashita and Pedro. Thank you, Peter. And I'll just pass quickly back to Peter to close the session. And thank you all for joining us.
Well, thank you, Catherine, for chairing as usual so seamlessly and competently. Apologies to everybody for my more rambling contributions to today's discussion, but I really appreciate the willingness of our two fascinating speakers and their work to give us this wonderful content to work with and to try to make these bridges. I'll just explain again that this was thanks to Anthony stepping in for late in the game. This was a chance to have our session on schedule without what we were originally planning to be the kind of the ideal match with Binita's work. But I think we found, as usual, through our network and our focus on sort of the organic emergent opportunities and understandings that come through network thinking, that we had a great discussion regardless, and I think much more germane to what PATIO is really about, which I really always delighted when we can get our broader geographies speaking to each other directly or indirectly. So thank you to both of you, and thank you to all our audience who've joined us yet again, and we'll see you next time.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everyone. And in case anybody is not signed up to the PATIO mailing list, the link is in the chat. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.